Bales, he's a board member and facilities director for the Chisholm Trail Museum here in town. The museum is located at 502 North Washington, right across from the courthouse. This is Jim's 7th year as a board member. He's a very active volunteer there at the museum. He researches county history and has a wealth of knowledge about the history of Wellington and Summit County. And he has spoke for us several times, and we always enjoy his talks and that. So let's welcome Jim tonight.
Okay, so thanks for coming. Wow, big crowd. Okay, I'm here to talk about the history of the Pioneer Cemetery, the little cemetery that gets no respect. And so I'm going to talk first about the Wellington Town Company, the founders of the town, mainly to give you some background information because these guys, many of their names are interwoven with my story tonight. Then I'm going to go over the history, how the cemetery got plotted out, and then probably go through some of the things that were found in the 70s, and then maybe go over some history of some people that are buried there. That's probably the most fun part of it. There's a few maps in here. My wife thinks I put too many maps, but to me maps really kind of tell the story sometimes. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of pictures from the 1870s, so the visuals are not as exciting as some of my other presentations, but I'll do the best I can. I hope it's entertaining for you. Like I said, there's a lot of newspaper clippings. I'll try to read what's on the newspaper clippings, but again, it's not much of a visual when you look at newspaper clippings. So anyway, Wellington Town Company had 8 members. They came with, in 1871, they came to settle here, and of course, when they got to Meridian, which was supposed to be the county capital, they found an all-night 24-hour poker game, and that didn't settle with them, so they moved a little farther upstream of the Slate Creek and founded Wellington. There were 8 members. Up there was Mr. John McMahon. He was from Pennsylvania. Sorry, I got my notes right here. So he was from Pennsylvania, and he fought for the Union, so he was a Civil War soldier. His claim was 1 mile west of Wellington. He served as county commissioner for a term, and he also helped found the Presbyterian Church. Mr. A. Jordan, he was a Confederate soldier. He was from Tennessee, but he ended up in Texas after the war. He was injured in the war. He lost the use of his right arm. And he worked as a Texas cowboy and made a ride up here, and when he got up here, he evidently decided to stay in the area. And he met the people that were forming the town, and he got in with them and took a claim. It was said that he was he served as sheriff for a short period of time. He was kind of appointed, and it said that he was fearless, and he was a dead shot, even with his crippled right arm. So he was one of the better. He eventually sold out his holdings and moved off to Idaho and died up in Oregon. Let's see, Mr. Prairie Davis, he was from Texas. He also was a Confederate soldier. He was a cattleman from Texas, and he drove, him and his wife both drove herds of cattle up to here, and they would winter here and then take them on up to the railroad up north. But they would winter here so that they would get in on the spring, and maybe they'd make a second run, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was here when the town founders came here, and so he decided to get in on a good deal, and he took a claim as well. Northeast of town. His name probably will show up on one of the maps. Mr. McCulloch. John McCulloch, he was also from Texas. He brought his family up through this area in 1868, went on to Colorado, but when he got there, they thought it was too cold there, and he thought it was so beautiful down here, and he knew the land was going to be given away, so sold cheap, so he came back with his family and settled here. And I think he moved to Caldwell, I'm not positive about that, Caldwell, Iowa, and died there. Okay. Mr. Captain Lewis K. Myers, he was a Union soldier and a captain. He also was a surveyor, and he was the person that laid out the town. So any of the town addresses that 1st, 2nd, 3rd Street, or A, B, C, and G, you can blame Mr. Lewis for that, or Mr. Myers for that, sorry. Dr. Philip A. Wood, for years I looked for him. I figured he was a Civil War surgeon. Not so. He went to California when the Civil War was going on. He received his medical degree from New York and moved to California with his family. He was out there through most of the war, then moved back to Paola, Kansas, and was working with our next fellow, Mr. Godfrey. And he came down from Paola with his family and settled here. He served as mayor once. Mr. C.R. Godfrey, Clark R. Godfrey. He was not a soldier that I can find out, but he was a 49er and he made the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. He was moved back and was in the Paola area and served 3 terms as a state legislature while he was up at Paola. And then when he made the run down here, he came down to Paola with a group of about 5 settlers that settled in here. He was Wellington's first postmaster, which he had in his drugstore. He had a drugstore in Paola, and when he loaded up, he loaded the front window, everything, and hauled it down here, hired guys to drive it down here, and set up and put that big glass front window in a log cabin. So he was quite a character. And our last guy, Mr. Randall, who you'll hear more about, he was also a Union soldier, originally from New York, but he was a shoemaker. And he also came with the Paola group and took a claim northeast. We'll hear more about that in my story here. So now let's go on with the history of the city cemetery. Now, it was never called the Pioneer Cemetery, not that I could find until the 70s. Then it starts showing up in the newspapers as the Pioneer Cemetery. But prior to that, it was just called the City Cemetery or the Wellington City Cemetery. And then for a while, through the early 1900s, it was called the Old City Cemetery. And most of my information comes from this article in the Wellington Modern Press, 1898. Says Cities of the Dead, what a title. Some facts concerning the cemeteries of Wellington, old and new. And this article says, and it says that Major Alfred Randall, now that's the first I was major. I don't know that he was a major in the Army, but maybe I never did find that. He dedicated 10 acres, now we're key on that 10 acres, in the northeast corner of his quarter section, adjoining the town site. And we'll come back to the rest of this article later on. And here's a picture of Mr. Alfred Randall, the shoemaker soldier. Now there's a reason that Mr. Randall set aside that, and he was very, well, he really wanted to do the cemetery thing. There was a reason for that. While he came down with the Paola group in 71, he came down by himself. He left his wife and his 3 children up there in Paola. While he was here building the cabin or whatever, getting things situated, his wife contracted an illness, and she passed away up in Paola. So he had to go back to Paola and bury her, and so he was still grieving. When he got up there, he didn't know what to do with the children, so he just packed them up, and he brought them back to Wellington. So, like I said, he was still grieving. He probably saw the need for the cemetery. He was still very emotional about that. He stayed with Dr. Wood, Dr. Philip Wood and his wife, and they helped raise the children for a while until he got a house and got started. So they got together with Dr. Wood, C.R. Godfrey, and Mr. Randall got together and they plotted out the cemetery. You can't see this very well, it's kind of washed out, but this is a cemetery plot. They formed what they call the Wellington Cemetery Association. And they organized this plot and they put it in the court record in 1872. So they actually had a plot laid out there. We're going to come back to the size of that plot and what it looks like. I'll have another map of that. Here's a little tidbit out of Wellington Modern Press in 1872, where Mr. Godfrey says, all parties having lots or wanting lots or whatever, please come forward and pay the money. And a lot was $6 back then. So then they could get their deeds. Now, here is an article in 1878 newspaper, the Wellingtonian, that says that the city of Wellington purchased from the Wellington Cemetery Association the grounds known as the City Cemetery, and the cost was $250. Then it lays out how it's going to get paid. And I want you to note that this is signed off by the then mayor, Mr. J. Bohanna. okay? We'll come back to that name. So that was in 1878. This also is in 1878, and August, so later on in the year. And this is an ordinance number 89, I think it says, that states that the city is going to add 3 mil tax levy to personal taxes to pay for the indebtedness or the debt of the cemetery, plus other city expenses. So they tacked on other city expenses. I thought that was confusing. But I also want you to note that the mayor who signed this ordinance is Mr. A.W. Shearman. He was a businessman on Main Street, Ab Shearman. He had actually the first mercantile store here on Main Street. But keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that. And give it some kind of context, visual context. This was Wellington in the 1880s. So this is not quite what was going on in 72, but through this time period that the cemetery was active, because it was only active through 1872 through 1882. So a 10-year time frame, and this is what the town looked like at that time. And don't get me wrong, people were buried there after that, but by that time, Prairie Lawn Cemetery had been plotted out, and so it was not as active. So anyway, here is an article from 1879. Now, bringing this article in to show that this cemetery really never got respect. I've come across articles in the mid-70s, 75 I think, where Godfrey or Wood talked about how run down the cemetery looked and just wasn't taken care of. Well, so this is 1878, and it says in here that it appears that cattle and pony herds are permitted to parade its precincts, or invade its precincts, and the result, graves are trodden down, gravestones remorselessly upset, and so they were upset with it almost from its inception. It just never was taken care of. There was other articles about coyotes and herds of buffalo running through it. So it just never was really taken care of. They did put a fence up about 78, I think, but it didn't stay very long because another article said that the fences were down. This was an article in the Wellingtonian in 79, and I put this one in there because it was kind of a satirical, kind of a cute jab is what it was. And it's the story of a man who comes to Wellington and he's dying of consumption, tuberculosis. And he comes to Wellington because he thinks it's be a nice, peaceful little town to die in. Except he goes out to the cemetery and he finds no fine tombstones, no beautiful vines, roses to mark the resting place of that silent community, no fence to protect it from the hooves of beasts. I cannot be laid out there. So he turned his face north and shook the dust of Wellington from his feet and left town. So, I mean, it was probably fiction, but it was just showing that there just wasn't a lot of respect for the cemetery. And a lot of people wanted that. I mean, this is their resting place, their family's resting place. So this was kind of the start of deciding that they needed a new cemetery. Now, the other part of that aspect was it was getting filled up. They set aside this 5 acres, 10 acres, whatever it was, because we don't really know. And it was getting filled up to the point where they didn't know where to put another body. So they needed to do something for the cemetery. So in 1882, the city council put out an order for the cemetery, the new cemetery, to be surveyed. And they didn't really get that going until 1883. I don't know exactly when the first burial was out of Prairie Lawn because I didn't do a lot of research on Prairie Lawn. But 83, I'm sure. So when you go out there, and I'll get to this later, but if you go out to the cemetery, you see a headstone that says 1870 or 18, you'll know that that person originally was not buried at Prairie Lawn Cemetery. It was probably buried at the city cemetery. Now, it was a beautiful cemetery. When they laid it out, they had a beautiful plan for it. This is not the best one. I pulled this one off the internet, I think. But it had these circular drives, and you could go through, and then they also sold off areas, like where the veterans were, and places where secret societies, the Odd Fellows, the Masons, they had a certain plot that they could keep just for their members if they wanted. And they did a lot of beautification from the start, where they didn't do that, of course, with the city cemetery. And that affected how people really changed where they were buried. Now, this one is in 1893, so here now we're 10 years after the really active period of the city cemetery, and it says that the condition of the old city cemetery needs to be looked into. Cemetery gates are down, and the fence is in bad condition, so it just never ever got respect before or after. Next, I'm going to go talk about the Civil War soldiers. As you noticed in that slide before, the veterans had their own little area, and the GAR, Grand Army Republic, which was the Civil War Veterans Association, they bought a large area of the cemetery, of the Prairie Lawn Cemetery, to put in their memorial and to get some of their dead to be buried there. And they wanted a nice memorial. Every year they did have memorials there. And this was a list that they published in the paper almost yearly. It's almost the same list every year, but of all the soldiers that were buried, supposedly all the soldiers, that were buried at the city cemetery, and then a super long list of all the soldiers that were buried at Prairie Lawn Cemetery. I put this list up, and you can't probably see it very well, because this is an incomplete list. I suppose that you had to be a GAR member to be on the list, but there are a lot of soldiers in that cemetery still that don't make that list. Of course, the top of the list every year, of course, was Mr. Thomas Dixon, the colored soldier. We'll come up to him in a little bit, but he did make the newspaper every year. So the GAR, in their wisdom, decided in 1931 they really wanted to dress up their memorial. And this was after, they acquired the cannons that sit down at Heritage Park now. They acquired the cannons, I think that was 1915 or 1917. But they acquired the cannons, and they actually sat out there at the cemetery to begin with at each end of their veterans memorial. But anyway, they wanted to dress this up, so they put out this statement, and they said that all the cemetery headstones that were paid for by the federal government that were at the city cemetery still belonged to the federal government, and they were going to move those headstones from the city cemetery to Prairie Lawn Cemetery so that they could dress up their memorial. And this is what this says: if you're a family member and you don't want this done, let us know. Well, most of these family members, most of these soldiers that were out there, their family members were long gone or moved on, and so there was no way that they could complain or resist. So they moved most of those headstones out there. And if you go out to the cemetery now, if you go out to the cemetery now, it's these, right here, this first 7, 8 headstones right here were all soldiers that they may be still buried out at the city cemetery, but their headstones are here. And that was a unfortunate deal, because now we don't know where those gentlemen were originally buried, and we don't really know if they're buried, because several were disinterred and then reinterred in this cemetery. We don't know if they all got moved. We do know the headstones got moved.
Didn't they uncover some when they built the car dealership too?
They did, and I'm going to come to that in just a little bit. Yeah, that's definitely, that actually is my segue into the next section.
Oh, cool.
The tragic day.
Yeah.
So in 1971, let's see, how old would I have been? 71? 16 maybe? They were building cane motor for the garage, and they were digging, I believe it was a septic tank or something, but they were digging out there, actually west of the building, and they uncovered some graves, 5 graves. And Dorothy Day, who was working for the paper at the time, she wrote a very heart-wrenching article about that called A Tragic Day. If you get a chance to read it, you can sure see her emotion in there. But they went through, like I said, there were 5 graves, and one of them was a child. What they could find of the remains and the coffins, they had been deteriorated quite a bit. But they took what was there, and she talked about it in great detail. They took those remains and then just put them in a plain wooden box. I think there's some pictures of some of the burials that they dug up. And there's a picture, you can see the plain wooden box that's set to the side. So it's, the coffins or that they dug out had silver hinges and nice lock sets, and they put them in a hard pine box and moved them out to Prairie Lawn Cemetery and buried them out there. And I don't know if that's marked or what. I haven't looked at any of those records. But it's kind of sad. So that was 5 graves west of the building. Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. This is a plat map, 1887 plat map. You ask, well, how did that happen? You can't see this very good, but this shows the cemetery goes all the way down to the creek. Now, that's, and Sherry said, it tells me stories of some graves that were down close to the creek. I find it really hard to believe, because that's about, I don't know how much an area that is. I have to measure that off. This is the 1883 atlas, so this is earlier than this one, the 87. And here's a blow-up of that one. And it shows the cemetery back here, and the creek's quite a ways away. And the 1902 plat map, it shows, again, the cemetery is much smaller and away from the creek. Now, if you remember, here's the 1918 plat map. And it again shows the old cemetery in just the corner section, and it's quite a ways from the creek. Now, I'm guessing that that's the original 10 acres, because when I went out there, the plat looks to me like it says 300 something by 300. Well, I measured it myself, and it measures, I think it was 375 by 282. And my calculations, please check my calculations, but I figure that's about 2.5 acres, which not very much. So if he did set aside 5 acres, which is what I believe that is, and they used all of the 5 acres, why, yeah, there's going to be grave sites all the way to that parking lot for the church. Now Dorothy Day, she put out this article about what's moral and what should we do, should we exhume all these graves, or something should be done about this, and please write a letter. And unfortunately, they received 5 postcards, letters from people. So there was only 5 concerned citizens that answered her call. And so nothing was done. The city said, well, there's not much we could do. We didn't have any records because the records burned up in a fire, and the land was sold in good earnest. So there's nothing we can do. We'll just put the remains in these pine boxes and ship them out to Prairie Lawn. Now, I don't know about fire. There was a fire in 1881 that burnt most of the block, where the quilt shop is, down. Actually, the same block that got hit by the tornado, but that burned in 1881. But City Hall was across the street, and it didn't get touched. But it did get hit by the tornado in 1892. And you can't see it, this is a bad picture of it, but this here is the city building. That's what was left of it after the tornado. So it went from there to just a corner section. So that's probably where the records went. And as I said, I went out and measured this myself. If you pull this up and look at it, it looks like it says 300 by 3 something. And maybe it's 375. But again, if that's just 2.5 acres, then there's a whole lot more cemetery that's still there. All right, let's move right on. We're doing good. Histories of some of the people buried in the cemetery. This is the most fun part for me, I think. As I said before, a lot of people were interred in the cemetery, but then they were dug back up and moved to the Prairie Lawn Cemetery. I didn't realize how many, but quite a few. If you go through that cemetery and you're looking at the headstones, if you see a headstone that says something before 1882, you know that that person was originally at the city cemetery. Now this article, back to this Cities of the Dead article, in 1898, it said that the first interment was the son of the widow Cleveland. She was the landlady of the town's first inn. He died of pneumonia in February of 1872. Now, Louisa A. Cleveland, I found her. She was born in New York, and she was sister to Mary Bates. Mary Bates was also kind of a prominent citizen here in town. She had 2 children besides the one that passed away, and she helped to organize the Methodist Church. When it says ran the first inn that I know of, it was called the Frontier House, and it was owned by Scott Cummins. But that doesn't mean she didn't work for him. She did prove up her claim, and then she sold her claim in 1883 and moved back to New York area. But I couldn't find any information about the son. Anyway, now the second burial, if you go back to that article, it says the second was the man named Lynch, who in March was strung up by vigilantes to a tree on Slate Creek for killing Dana Maxfield in a saloon row. So, Mr. John Lynch, and this picture, Della Schaefer and her husband did a lot of extensive work researching a lot of these grave sites years ago, and so she believes that Mr. Lynch is buried right there in the very far corner. And in one of his articles, it does say that he was buried at a kind of a swell at the top of the swell before it slopes back down to the creek. So it's very possible, but she did some grave witching or something, and she believes that he's buried right there in the corner. So he was hung by vigilantes for shooting Dana Maxfield. Maxfield's not right, Mansfield is his name. Mansfield was from Caldwell. He was a little bit of a rough character, but he was a good enough guy. In Caldwell at that year, there was a prairie fire, and it burned down most of their feed and some of their grain, and so they were a little bit low on feed. So he came to Wellington to try to buy some feed, and some guys got together and got some money and said, "Hey, Dana, go check this out." So he comes to Wellington, and he's trying to procure supplies, but in the evening he goes to the saloon, and he sits down and he gets into a card game with John Lynch, the proprietor of the saloon, I don't remember his name, and a guy by the name of Red. And they don't say, but there's an argument that ensues, and I think this Red must have been caught cheating or something, because the fight is actually between Mansfield and Lynch and this Red character. And so guns are drawn, excitement flares. Maxfield and Lynch go out the saloon door, and they take up positions outside the saloon, and they're watching the saloon door. Mr. Red, he comes up to the saloon door, and he's got his gun in his hand, and he starts shooting out there, and they shoot at him. Well, he gets hit in the abdomen. Well, the guns back then weren't very powerful guns, and I don't know if but anyway, the round didn't penetrate. It went through his clothing, but it didn't penetrate his skin. But he didn't know that at the time. He just knows he got shot, so he backs up in the saloon. Mr. Lynch and Maxfield are still outside. Mansfield. Mr. Mansfield decides, well, this is not what I want to do. I need to get the heck out of here. So he starts heading for the livery stable. Well, in the meantime, Red's gone out the back door of the saloon, and Mr. Lynch thinks he sees Red making an escape, and he shoots him. And unfortunately, it turns out to be Dana Mansfield that he killed, not Red. So he's in a panic. He knows that he did wrong. He knows that vigilantes are going to come after him. What's he do? He shoots himself in the foot. And then says, well, I got hurt in the ruckus. He shoots himself in the foot. Anyway, he goes into the Frontier Inn, which Mr. Cummins is running, and they try to patch him up. That's why I put Mr. E.P. Ritchie. He was the second doctor that came to Wellington, and he was also our first mayor. He was our first mayor here in town. Anyway, he patches him up and then tries to hide him. And in the meantime, about 100 riders from Caldwell come up to find Mr. Lynch and do their justice. And they eventually do find him. They take him away from the officials, and they take him down to the Slate Creek. just south of town, and there's a big elm tree that has a big hanging limb on it, and they hang. Mr. Ritchie wrote an article. He would talk to him long enough to get kind of well, his last will and testament, so to speak. And he did have a sister back east. Other than that, he didn't have much family. So anyway, so goes Mr. Lynch, and he was our second burial at the cemetery. Now, since we're on the case of criminals and hooligans, of course, the next burial, and this is 2 years later, there is the story of the three that were hung south of town on Slate Creek. Mr. Charlie Smith, Billy Brooks, and Benjamin Hasbrook. Mr. Hasbrook was a lawyer. Mr. Billy Brooks was just kind of a hooligan, but he was the town marshal for Newton for a short period of time while the Cowboys were really rough. And Charlie Smith, who was also injured in the war, and I think he either lost the use of his arm or he lost his arm completely. I think he lost his arm completely. He was kind of a bartender down there in Colorado. So this story kind of comes right out of some Hollywood Western story. The Bales Stagecoach Company got the mail contract to deliver the mail down to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And the Southwestern Stage Company, who Billy Brooks and Charlie Smith and Hasbrook was their lawyer, they conspired. There was more than just these three. There was like 5 that were caught. There's like 7 or 8 that were conspired to steal the mule stock and horses from the Bales Stagecoach Company. And they did. They stole them, and then they run them down into the Indian Territory to hide them. Well, at that time, the Indians decided to get off reservation and kind of go on a rampage. And they got down into that ruckus, and they decided, well, this is no good. So they come back into Kansas with all these mules, and they got caught. It was a lot more to the story because they had to chase these guys all over western Kansas to catch them and stuff. But they got them, they brought them in, and while there were 100 and so vigilantes in Caldwell that helped them capture them, there were also 150 vigilantes from Caldwell who come up and took them away from the Sumner County officials and then took them down to the tree and hung them. Anyway, Della believes that these three are buried not too far from Mr. Lynch, and they're all buried together. And the articles state that the men were laid out, all three, right in a row and buried on a swell there at the cemetery. So maybe this, and you know, it was the of the day, they usually took all the bad guys and planted them usually outside the cemetery grounds or hallowed grounds, or at least right on the edge. So that makes sense if this at the time was the official line. Anyway, all right. Mr. Thomas Dixon, our colored soldier. Now, can't find a whole lot of records about him. When I looked for the military records, there's 20 Thomas Dixons that were colored soldiers that fought for the Union. Now, Dorothy Day, in her article, she said she found some records in the GAR records that are at the museum that list him being with the 11th Illinois or something like that. Now, I looked through those GAR records on my list, but no way I can find it. There's books and books and books, and they're all written in scriptive handwriting, and so I didn't find anything that listed. However, I did find a Thomas Dixon that was with that unit, and he mustered in it in New Orleans, and basically just did a lot of guard duty. But if this is our guy, then I hope somebody else takes this information and tries to find more about him. Anyway, as far as we know, he died in 1872, and they buried him there. They listed him in the GAR records, but somebody thought enough of him to make him a member of the GAR, because the GAR didn't actually form until 1882, which I find that interesting. The other interesting thing is they took all those headstones and they took them out to the Prairie on, but they didn't take his. So it's thank goodness, because now we know where he's buried. Mr. Bohanna, Jeremiah Bohanna, our mayor, he was a real estate investor from back east, and he moved to Wellington in mid-1875. he brought his wife and his family here, and his son, I can't remember his name, Daniel, I want to say, but that may not be right. Edward died in, I want to say 75 or 76, and he was buried out at the city cemetery. Mr. Bohanna died in 81. Now, he served mayor twice. In 77, as we were looking at those records, and Mr. Ab Shearman took over as mayor. Well, that next season, Mr. Bohanna was reelected, but he also was very ill. I found a notification where he went to Eureka Springs, Arkansas for his health. My guess is he had consumption, tuberculosis or something, but don't know for sure. Anyway, he died while in office, and his was one of the largest funerals, or two large funerals. A funeral procession over a half mile long. You can imagine all these horse and wagons going out to that cemetery. He was buried out at the cemetery in 1881, but he's not out there now because his wife died in 1903, and she was, the other two sons came back and buried her out at the Prairie Lawn Cemetery. They disinterred both Jeremiah and Edward. Now, all they found of Edward's remains was part of the casket. They found most of Mr. Jeremiah, and they moved him out to Prairie Lawn Cemetery, where he's buried there now. But because they couldn't find a whole lot of Edward, they have a headstone both at Prairie Lawn and at the city cemetery. You'll see this one out at the city cemetery, which I thought was kind of nice. Yeah, this is just an article talking about the two sons that came and moved him. At least they did write an article about that, so I got that history. Mr. James Turner, there was a fellow here brought me some info about, yes sir, the London Township reunion, is that what you call it, or just a kind of get together?
No, it's First Families into Sumner County, 18.
But you had something in there about London Township.
Well, they came into London and Belle Plaine, both sides of the Minnescombe.
Okay. So this Mr. Turner was from the London Township area. And he got into a row with a guy by the name of R.M. Neal. And he actually fired his gun first. And they got into this gunfight, and they emptied both their revolvers at each other. And supposedly they just, to the point where the guns were empty, and then they jumped on each other, and they were fighting, and somebody pulled them apart. And yeah, they were bloodied, and he didn't think it was all right. He jumped on his horse, and he said, well, Mr. Neal says, we're going to finish this fight because I don't want to do it again. And he said, I'll come back when I'm feeling better, because right now I'm hurt, I'm injured, I'll come back and hit you when I'm later. So anyway, he rides off, and not too long after that, he's found in the roadside, and he's still alive, but one of the bullets nicked his carotid artery. And the doctor got there and was tending to him, but there was nothing he could do. Mr. Neal was prosecuted, but he was, because Mr. Turner, and there were eyewitnesses say that he fired the first shot, he was let go.
Mr. Neal was founder of London.
The town?
The town of London.
Oh, is that right?
Which was on the military road to Fort Sill.
So when did he found the town? Is that, I mean?
1870. Started 1870, 1871, I think, officially they found.
Didn't mention that in the articles, but I'm sure you're right. But anyway, it's an interesting read. If you ever need any of this, listening to these articles, just let me know. And it really is fascinating sort of stuff. Miss Ida Chenoweth was a young 15-year-old girl that came down with a little bit of a fever. Dr. Wood went over to tend to her. He didn't see anything that was alarming, so he said, well, just keep her inside and keep her warm, and hopefully it will break and everything will be okay. Not an hour or so later, her father comes to her and says, do you need anything? And she says, just some lemon water. He fixes that for her. He turns around and she makes a funny noise, and she passed away. Just a sad story. But she's buried there in our cemetery. Here's one I found that was a very sad story, but there's no headstone or markers. You know, here's a family that might have been the family that was dug up in 71. Mr. Ahard and his wife, and I think he had 4 children. They were actually going to go out and pick plums, and it had been after heavy rain, and the river had come up, but it had gone down some, and they thought everything was safe. They were taking their wagon through the creek, and of course they hit some deep water, even clear back then, 1878, and the wagon went down, the horses almost drowned. I think there were three children died, and Mrs. Ahard, and only one survivor, and Mr. Ahard. He swam to the edge. Anyway, so they were buried out at the cemetery, but no headstone, no remains. Just an article I found in the paper, and I thought it was a pretty sad story. Nope, have no idea. Henry Horner, another small child, he was fell off the wagon and got run over with logs. The wagon carrying logs, he was run over, brought to town, but they couldn't revive him, and he passed away. Again, another one that's buried out there. Have no idea where. And it's just kind of sad. We need to have a memorial set aside for some of these people that we do find that don't have them. Now, Noah Dixon family. Sherry is not here to talk about it, but she's more involved in this family than what is interesting here that all members of the family died within a year. The husband, the wife, the daughter, they all died within months of each other. And the small one was taken by a family member or a friend over to Ark City. I believe he was a doctor, but even she, over there in Ark City, she died about 2 or 3 months later. And they brought her back and buried him alongside the family. But at least there's a headstone to mark that family. Mr. Charlie Bates, now I'll come back to him in a minute, but he was another Union soldier, and there's no markings on him, no information to say that he's a Union soldier, but he's buried out there. And Mrs. Sarah Wood. So Dr. Wood came to Wellington in 1871, and then brought his family down here, his wife and their 2 children, and 2 boys. And she was the matriarch of the community. I would like to say that she is Mrs. Wellington. Even the newspapers mark that she justly be accorded as having been one of the mothers of Wellington society, having been one of the very few ladies who organized and molded it. She was an educated woman. She graduated from a women's school in Wesleyan School in New York. And so she brought culture to the town. And not only that, she would help. When Dr. Wood had a patient that just couldn't take care of himself, she would go attend to that person or even bring them into their own home. She helped found the Presbyterian Church. She just got a lot of things going. But she was rather sickly. She spent her last 3 weeks of life in bed. Once again, Dr. Wood thought she was going to be fine, and she passed away. Hers was the other big funeral, and they said her procession was probably 3/4 of a mile long with wagons and horses and stuff as they led her out to the cemetery. Now, she was originally buried at the city cemetery, but I couldn't find her. And finally, I went looking Prairie Lawn, and my gosh, there she is. Buried out at Prairie Lawn Cemetery, and she is on the north side, just straight north of the mausoleum. That little red dot marks where her gravesite's at. Anyway, that's one that when you're out there, you ought to look that one up. And within her headstone, if you look around, I counted at least 5 headstones that were pre-1882. So a lot of people were disinterred and reinterred in that area. Now, her father, next person, Emma Ruth Godfrey. She was Clark Godfrey's wife, and she also was a matriarch of our town. She helped found the Methodist Church. She also did lots of community things. I think her and probably Sarah Wood worked together to bring culture to Wellington. And she passed away, I think, in '77. And her funeral was not quite as big as Sarah's, but it was still pretty considerable. And she was the daughter of that Charlie Bates that I showed the headstone a little earlier. And they're both still out there. Mr. Godfrey, of course, moved on to Colorado, I think in 1880, and he died out there. He remarried and had a couple more children, as I recall, Mary Wellington. So anyway, that's pretty much my program. The reason we did this program is to try to draw attention to that cemetery so we can raise some money and do some beautification work, try to give it the respect that it never got through all the last 100 years. And I think Sherry and Jane and the rest of them at the Historical Society are doing a great job. If we can give them whatever support they need, then we need to do that. Monetarily, physically, whatever. So is there anything you want to add, Jane, with what the plan is? Like, you've got a flagpole that's going up, correct?
We haven't got it, I mean, that's what we're working on to get funds for.
We're getting funds for the flagpole, and the city is going to put in the mount for the flagpole?
Yes.
And they're going to run the power? No, is it power or is it?
No, it'll be solar power.
Solar power.
Yeah. The city will put a new pad, they'll take the old one down, put a new pad in, and put the pole and everything up for us.
Okay. And then the sign?
The kiosk is in the picture there.
Right.
And that's already up
And the pad, I believe, is poured for the sign that goes on the corner, right?
Yes, it's poured for the stone that'll go on the corner.
And the stone will say Pioneer Cemetery, correct?
Wellington Pioneer Cemetery, and then 1871.
Okay.
And that's come, as soon as Dawson Monument in Winfield that did that for us, and they haven't been able to get over there to get it in because of the weather, for one thing, and they got behind on other stones for people that they needed to do, and they said after Memorial Day, well, they'll get a hold of James and stuff, and so.
Well, that's probably this summer anyway, we'll get that.
It should be, I would guess, sometime this month. It should be in.
If we raise enough money, are we looking at a new fence or something, or?
Around the outside?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
You can't hunt, because that's a state highway.
Okay.
160 is a state highway. You cannot, where the fence, there's a chain link fence there, it can't go any farther east than where it is, because the state does not want the vision for drivers blocked. And so that's why that stone that's going on the corner is going in a certain spot, because we don't want to block the vision. We don't want the state to come in and say, oh, you got that in the wrong place, we're going to move it. We don't want that, so, and we can't put an outside fence up. We have checked the fencing that's around some of those family plots out there. One of them was from that Bates, I think.
Yeah, Bates and
that,
Godfrey.
I have checked with the Ginn Manufacturing down in Caldwell. It's the only place I could find that he came up and looked at it, and he's kind of likes, he's a real history buff and stuff, and he said that fence is so old, but he said most of the pieces are missing. You see where there's spots in there? They're not missing, they're buried in the ground where they've fallen over. And he said, he told us it'd take about $10,000 to fix all that family plot fencing and replace the pieces and fix it and everything. That's something we're looking at down the road.
Yeah.
Piece by piece. Small cemetery plot and because we would like to get it fixed too.
Well, anyway, that's why we're here. You guys can help in any way, we sure appreciate that. There were several stories that I came across that I didn't put in tonight, and I probably didn't, maybe some of you guys know some stories of people that are buried out there. Please tell me, but I only put in enough to try to make it an interesting story. I'm really amazed at the information I learned about some of the burials at Prairie Lawn. And that was confusing to me as I go through an article, I read it says it's in the city cemetery. And then I find out that the person was actually buried in the Prairie Lawn Cemetery. And this is clear back up into the 20s. But yeah, they just refer. A lot of people were buried in our city cemetery, the old cemetery, from Belle Plaine and Caldwell. Mr. Noah Dixon, I didn't bring this up, but Mr. Noah Dixon and his family, he was Caldwell's first mayor. And he was living in Caldwell, and he was a businessman, well thought of, but he was buried up here. Now, wait a minute, was he originally buried down there?
I don't think so,
Okay. Anyway,
but I don't know for sure.
yeah. But why he was buried up here is kind of a conundrum. But
My father didn't want to be buried in our little country cemetery because he was afraid it would be have up.
yeah, and that comes up time and time again. I think most of the people that disinterred their family members and moved up Prairie was the same concerns. They saw this cemetery never get any respect, never get taken care of, and they said, well, this is not for me. We're going to move our family up there. So,
And I will say that the sexton we have for Prairie Lawn, James Hurlson, is doing a fantastic job keeping that cemetery mowed and trimmed and looking good. He does a really good job, and it's hard.
So the Pioneer Cemetery is actually still officially the city property?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. Yes, it's under city.
No.
any other questions? Any other comments?
What, who was it that was taken from that cemetery?
You're thinking of David Payne, Captain David Payne. He wasn't ever buried in that cemetery. He was actually buried in Prairie Lawn. And he was dug up, what, 97?
Yeah, well, I said not too long ago, but
I want to say not 97. And that was kind of a crazy thing.
What are the people buried behind the nursing home out there?
So those are from the poor farm.
Uh-huh.
The farm was there. And when people came to this county in the 70s to make a new life. A young man and his wife and his kids would come here to get some cheap land and start farming. They get here, he'd die of typhoid or whatever, and here she was strapped with a couple of kids and no money, no way to get back. If she had any family back east, no way to get back east. And so that's when they started the poor farm, so that they have a place to go and at least sustain themselves. And it kind of turned into a medical infirmary because of all the sickness. So
That's sad because it's not marked.
it is very
I know
sad.
somebody spiked it off a little bit, but it's just sad.
But, I mean, because there are records, there are better records there than there are for the city cemetery. And you can find names of people that died in the poorhouse and they're probably buried out there, but where they're located, that's impossible. But you could put a kiosk out there with those names and that is doable. Della also did a lot of work on that too. She needs a big round of applause if she was here.
So they stopped burying people in this cemetery in 1871, and there's not any allowance for people to be buried there?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
1881.
1880.
81 was when, I won't say it was stopped burial. That's not true. That's just when it became less active, because a lot of prairie lawn was done in 1883. So that's why I say anything earlier than 1883 probably were buried in the city cemetery first. You go to Prairie Lawn and you see a headstone that says 1882 or 1878. They probably were buried in the city cemetery first and then were disinterred and reinterred at Prairie Lawn. So Prairie Lawn started in 1883-84, and most burials started moving out there. There were still family members that were dying off, that their father or something was buried there, so they'd be buried at the city cemetery. The last burial was 2012.
Something like that.
That a family member could prove that they had a deed to the property out there, and they came in and had, I think it was, their ashes were buried there. It wasn't a full body, but
Right
still.
now, they're hesitant on burying anybody out there because the lack of gravestones.
Yeah,
They really don't
They don't
know.
have
They
a clue.
know where the plots are, but they don't know if anybody's buried there.
yeah.
And that, so they're very hesitant about burying anybody out there just because of that. Because they could be digging up at the
What's that?
plot and there's somebody already there.
Yeah.
And that.
Yeah, so, yeah, theoretically, somebody still could be buried there. I'm not sure it would just be their ashes, not a full body. But they have to prove that they had a deed to that. So, you know, that deed goes back to 1872. You know,
There's no solution to this, is there?
there was no solution. You know, the city was right in 1971, when it's not really the fault of anybody, because the records either got lost in the tornado or they just didn't keep good records. But you know, there's bodies buried there, and there's not much. You know, the best thing is leave them lay as best you can, give them as much respect as we can. And, you know.
What was the year of that tornado?
1892.
Is there any organization out there at a top, what kind of condition is the ground in
At the cemetery now?
at the cemetery?
Yeah, well, it's in pretty good condition. I think the sexton from the Prairie on still takes care of also both the cemeteries because they're in the city, and he does a pretty good job of
He does.
doing it. Yeah. It's just, and some of the stones have been replaced, or not replaced,
He
but put back
fixes some
up.
of them.
Yeah.
He has the knowledge and the materials and that to be able to repair some of them, because some of the stones you see, you know, broke off. But he only has enough of the clamps and things like that to do just a few at a time. And they have to set so long before he can take the clamps off. And he does what he can to get them done. This is the busy season, so he doesn't have time to fix stones. When it gets to be winter time, he's a little better at doing that. And I know he's got some out there he's fixed.
Yeah.
And it is a concern of his. He doesn't like them laying over like that. So he's doing the best he can.
Yes, sir.
Over on there, you said it was about 10 acres there?
So newspaper articles differ. Some say that 10 acres were set aside for the cemetery. Other articles say 5 acres. That one article that I referred to in 1898 says 5 acres. But even so, there's only, like I said, if we measure that out, my calculations say there's only 2.5 acres of fenced-in cemetery there right now. So if they had 5 acres and they filled it, like I think they did, then that's why we have the problem that they had in 71.
That's when they put the car right in there?
Yes.
That's when they started finding, and they found the 3 bodies there.
They found 5.
They found 5 bodies.
I'll bet if they dug around, they'd find that whole area, probably got bodies all the way through.
And then there's the parking lot, he didn't measure it.
No, I didn't mention the parking lot.
I talked to a young man several years ago. I just met him. We were having dinner at the steak house over there. And he told me that he helped build that Ford place, and he dug into graves, and they covered them up and just put cement over them.
So, see, some of that probably went on too, yeah.
Oh, sure.
I remember when that happened.
Because they think the cemetery went farther south.
He
to the
said
creek,
he was
to the south
there,
end,
he did.
where the storage units are, south of there.
I'm
We
sure
went all
it
the way
did.
there.
But no, I don't know. I don't really know.
But nobody knows for sure.
Yeah,
And that's-
nobody knows for sure how far west it went, how far south it went.
Yeah.
It was suggested that you take up a collection tonight. Is that going on?
It can. We'll pick up a collection if you guys want to pass the hat. I don't have a hat.
I don't have a hat.
But we'll definitely take up a collection and put it towards the coffins. That's why we're here.
I'll find
Actually, if you want to give it to Jane, that would be fine. Or if George wants to donate his hat, pass it around.
Yeah, she's gonna get a
Okay.
container.
Come on, George.
Sonny's getting a
I
container.
think Sonny's getting a container.
Oh, good. While she's doing that, I have a couple of stories that I came across that I couldn't prove were in the city cemetery, but they were Prairie on. Here's a story, found in the paper of this guy from his name was C.B. Anthony. He came down from Wichita, and he brought his young child, and he gave him to the marshal, city marshal at the time, who was also the sexton at the time. Was it 1887? And he just said, here, my son died, and my wife was sick back in Wichita, I gotta go. And just turned around, got back on the train and went back to Wichita. So the city marshal, he put something in the paper about this guy bringing his, child and just giving it to him. And the guy responded to his article and said, for his high on opium, he was sick, and his wife was sick.
Let's start on the
He
front
just
row.
couldn't manage, so that's why that happened. And,
If you fill this up, we're doing good.
yeah. This one I found interesting. Mr. George Boyer, he was a cattleman, and he was down, I think, by Caldwell, or in between here and South Haven somewhere. Anyway, he was down in the Indian Territories, and he was shot by a guy by the name of Lee. And so they buried him down there in the Indian Territories. Well, his family went down there and dug him up, brought him up, buried him on his home plot there, like I said, between here and South Haven somewhere. And he was buried there for several years, and then they went and they dug him up, and they moved him to Prairie Cemetery, where so he was reburied 3 times. And one of the people that went and viewed this said that the corpse was petrified, and it just gave him nightmares. But anyway, so and he's out there at the Prairie Cemetery. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to pass around a picture, like. What's that?
I like that, the body was pronounced petrified.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of cool stories. Well, oh, yeah. Well, let's answer that first, and then I'll come back there. I don't know that I have an answer. We're doing, putting up the kiosk. We want to put as many stories like this.
We're going to
on
put
the kiosk.
information, the history of it, and stories, and who's buried there, and the plot map, and everything else.
Yeah. So if you're a genealogist and you search up names of people that have been buried there, you can check that list. Jane started now. Money to help facilitate the flagpole, just the main thing right now, right?
Right,
Pay
yeah.
for the flagpole. And the sign's paid for,
And what?
the stone is paid for.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we'll move on from there, I think what they're planning on.
Then we'll move on to maybe being able to work on the fencing around some of those family plots. We won't be able to do that all at once, and it may be 2 or 3 years before that even gets started. Because I know the inn said it would take several months to even work on that and that, so.
Okay, so I got to put in a plug for the museum since I'm affiliated with the museum.
Yes.
We're having an event. Yeah, we're having an event coming up next Friday, June 14th.
Well, not
Not this Friday, next Friday, June 14th. It's called the Night at the Museums.
So we're partnering, I think my battery just died. We're partnering with the Glass Museum and the Railroad Museum, Prairie and Sherry's. And what we're going to do is for $10, you can get a ticket, and we'll be open from 5 to 8, all 3 museums. You can do some museum hopping and stop at each one, and we're going to have some hors d'oeuvres, and I know that the Glass Museum's going to have some hors d'oeuvres. I don't know what's the Railroad Museum.
all 3 museums will have some kind of a hors d'oeuvres and beverage of some sort.
Okay.
And you can go around and visit the museums, and we have a nice big raffle basket full of gift certificates, certificates to Fabiola's, to some of our businesses in town, some nice wine glasses, and some glass that's been donated, and all kinds of things in that. I think there's about 15, 20 different items in the basket.
With your $10 ticket, that buys you 1 raffle chance, correct? And you can buy more raffle chances at $1 a ticket.
Or
6 for 5.
6 for $5.
6 for 5. Sonny has those back there with him. She has a few of them.
5 to 8. If not, I'll take their name and I'll get them to them too.
It'll be fun. Oh, and we're going to unveil something big in the front lawn of the museum.
Are you going to have it ready? Don't promise what you can't do.
What's that?
Are you sure you're going to be ready? Ready for that?
We're going to do it one way or the other. Maggie's going to be there, and she's going to FaceTime it.
I see that little pole.
Hey, Jim.
The Chisholm Trail pole right there.
Thanks for coming.
Is the sign called in?
Thank you all, and thank you all so much for the donations. We really appreciate that. Will really, really help.
Is that what he's going to put
Now
up?
we just have to put chairs up.
Is that what he's supposed to be putting up? Yes. Okay.
As usual.